When most people think of dynasties, they imagine billionaires in skyscrapers, politicians in Washington, or old money families in gated mansions. But in the shadows of America's cities, another kind of dynasty was born. One built not on Wall Street, but on street corners. These were families who turned poverty into power, drugs into dollars, and survival into empire. Their names echoed through neighborhoods like legends, feared by rivals, chased by law enforcement, and admired by those who saw them rise from nothing. They blurred the line between criminals and kings, shaping culture as much as they shaped the streets. This is the story of the richest black crime families in America, their rise, their reign, and the legacy they left behind. People often say that money and crime walk side by side in many places. In America, some families turned that idea into something larger. They built lasting power and control. Their names moved quietly through neighborhoods, spoken softly with fear and awe. These families were not only single people doing bad things, they acted like dynasties, with many members working together across years. They learned how to use street rules and business moves to make a lot of money, even when the work was dangerous and illegal. Some of these groups rose from deep poverty and few choices. They found ways to turn small chances into big profits. Yet their success brought pain. Families broke, lives were harmed, and whole neighborhoods felt the cost of what these groups did every day. In this story, we look at the richest black crime families in the United States. We tell how they rose, how they lived, and what they left behind. Some fell fast, while others stayed long and kept their power for years on end. Our first group in this countdown is the Chambers brothers. People guessed their total money was around $50 to $60 million. They were four brothers who moved from a small place to a big city and used sharp plans to grow their trade. Detroit in the 1980s felt broken for many families. Factories closed and work disappeared. People lost hope, and a new drug called crack moved through the streets. The city changed fast, and the new drug hurt many lives and homes. The Chambers brothers came from Arkansas and saw an opening in Detroit. They were smart about the streets and used teamwork to build a wide network. With careful plans and strong trust between them, they grew their business quietly but quickly across the city. They used a method later called the crack house model to sell their product. Instead of selling openly on corners, they used empty houses and buildings. Those houses became places where many people would come every day to buy and to use drugs. This approach let them avoid some open police watching, and it also brought steady customers. Their houses worked like busy shops, bringing in a lot of cash. At the top of their power, they made huge sums, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars every single week. The money changed how they lived. They wore bright, costly clothes and heavy gold chains. They drove fine cars that turned heads on every block. Their new way of life showed what money could buy, even if it came from a harmful trade. People on the streets spoke their names with a mix of fear and respect. To some, the brothers were cruel and dangerous. To others, the brothers were examples that poor men could gain power and wealth through bold acts and unity. The Chambers brothers did more than sell drugs. They changed how the business worked in many cities. Other groups copied their model, and the crack house method spread to other places, growing the reach of addiction and the size of the market. Success also brought strong risks. Police began to notice the flow of money and people. Rivals watched the houses and competed. Betrayal, fights, and raids were common parts of the life they chose to lead in the streets each day. Eventually, law officers moved in with large raids and long court fights. Some brothers and allies faced very long prison times. The arrests ended much of their public control, and the houses that once ran day and night grew quiet under the law. Even after their arrests, the story of the Chambers brothers kept living in the city memory. Their rise and fall were a lesson to many, that a quick climb in the illegal trade often brings a hard fall and heavy loss of freedom. The story of the brothers shows both sides of crime life. There was money, fame, and a powerful image, but there was also fear, harm, grief, and many ruined lives. The bright cars and jewelry could not hide the damage felt by families and friends. This chapter is the beginning of a longer look at how crime built wealth and power for some families. We will meet other groups who used different ways to grow their influence, and who also left deep marks on their communities and on the nation. As we move on, remember that these stories are not simple or neat. They mix pain and pride, courage and choice. People who lived there had hard lives and few safe options. For some, crime seemed like a path out, though it cost dearly. The history of these families also connects to bigger problems, like poor jobs, weak city support, and long odds for many young people. When cities lose work and hope, other ways to survive can seem stronger and more real than the steady, low-paid jobs left behind. The Chambers brothers did not last forever, but their ideas and style echoed in other places. Their choices helped change how the drug trade worked in the United States. They became a part of a larger story about money, danger, and the life they built. The Chambers brothers once lived what many called the gangster dream. They had money, cars, houses, and power. But like many criminal empires before them, their success was short-lived. The same speed that brought wealth also brought a painful downfall. In 1988, the police carried out a series of raids on their crack houses and drug operations. The arrests were heavy and shocking. Several of the brothers were sentenced to life in prison, ending their control and their dream of endless wealth. Even though their empire collapsed, the Chambers brothers left behind a story that people still talk about today. Their name became part of Detroit's history, remembered as the family that reshaped the city's underworld and made millions during America's crack epidemic. After their fall, another name began to rise. This was the Black Mafia Family, often called BMF. At the height of its power, the group had a net worth of around $100 million, making them one of the richest crime families. BMF was founded by two brothers, Demetrius, known as Big Meech, and Terry, known as Southwest T. They started small in Detroit in the late 1980s, but they later moved their base to Atlanta, where they grew into a massive organization. By the early 2000s, BMF had spread across the United States. Their cocaine network reached from Los Angeles on the West Coast to Miami on the East Coast. They also had strong operations in Detroit and Atlanta, controlling a huge supply chain. It was reported that their empire handled more than $270 million during its peak years. The scale of their business was unlike most groups before them. They were organized, connected, and powerful, making them nearly untouchable for a time. What set BMF apart from many other groups was not only the drugs they sold, but also the image they created. Big Meech understood culture and style. He knew how to turn the crew into more than just dealers on the streets. He connected deeply with the music world, especially hip-hop. Rappers respected him, and many wanted to be around his lifestyle. Big Meech often appeared at concerts, private parties, and events, blending the world of crime with the glamour of entertainment. BMF became famous for their wild and expensive parties.
They threw gatherings where millions of dollars could be spent in a single night. Luxury champagne, famous musicians, and beautiful settings all showed that they lived in a different world than most people. The cars they drove were symbols of their power. Fleets of Bentleys, Ferraris, and Lamborghinis were parked outside their homes and clubs. Wherever they went, the image of wealth followed them, showing everyone that they had reached the top of street success. For many young people watching from the outside, BMF seemed larger than life. They looked like stars more than criminals. They dressed in designer brands, wore diamonds, and stood alongside famous rappers, blurring the line between a legal business and pop culture. But underneath all the shine, their empire was built on dangerous ground. Drugs brought violence, enemies, and the constant attention of law enforcement. The same fame that made BMF popular also made them more visible, and eventually investigators began to close in. Even so, during their peak, BMF showed how crime and culture could mix in powerful ways. They were not only selling cocaine, they were also shaping music videos, lyrics, and the hip-hop lifestyle. Their influence reached beyond the streets and into mainstream culture. People saw Big Meech not only as a drug dealer, but as a symbol of ambition. He built an image of confidence and power, showing how someone from nothing could rise to live like a king, even if the path was illegal. The Black Mafia family became a legend long before their downfall. They were spoken about in songs, praised by artists, and followed by many who wanted to live like them. Their story became a mix of crime, culture, and the dream of fast success. For years, BMF represented more than just a drug organization. They were proof of how far money, image, and connections could take a group. They reached across America, leaving a mark on both the streets and the music world that still lasts today.
The Black Mafia family left a mark that went far beyond drugs. They mixed street power with hip-hop culture, becoming icons of music and style. They inspired songs, appeared in music videos, and even became the story for a popular TV series. Even though the brothers eventually faced long federal prison sentences, their name still carries weight today. The BMF legacy is remembered as one of the richest and most powerful black crime families America has ever seen. A mix of crime and culture. As the BMF story faded, another name grew in New York. In the 1980s, during the height of the crack epidemic, when cocaine spread like fire and destroyed entire neighborhoods, the streets of Queens learned to fear and respect the Supreme Team. The Supreme Team was founded and led by Kenneth McGriff, known as Supreme. He and his crew transformed South Jamaica, Queens into their stronghold. Every corner, every block, and every dealer owed loyalty to Supreme's organization, which ruled like a military force. What made them different was their organization. Smaller groups came and went, falling apart quickly. But the Supreme Team was structured, disciplined, and strict. They did not operate like random street dealers. Instead, they built a system that was powerful and long-lasting. They didn't just sell drugs. They built something closer to a company. They created distribution channels, almost like a business chain, that made sure their product was always available. Their drugs dominated the streets, and no one could compete with their reach. In South Jamaica, the Supreme Team became more than a crew. They became an environment. If you lived there during the 1980s, you could not escape their presence. Their rules, their influence, and their control shaped everyday life for many people. The Supreme Team made millions of dollars from their drug empire. Their cocaine and crack operations brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars every day. Over the years, this added up to hundreds of millions, making them one of the richest street organizations. Supreme, the leader, was not like other flashy gangsters. Where others showed off gold chains, cars, and parties, he often presented himself as calm, serious, and businesslike. He wore nice suits, rode in limousines, and carried himself like a professional businessman. This image gave him influence beyond the streets. People in music, entertainment, and even Hollywood respected him. By the 1990s and 2000s, his connections reached into the music industry, including links with major rap artists and record labels, especially Murder Inc. records. He even tried to finance a film project, hoping to use movies to cement his name. This was part of his effort to appear as more than a drug dealer. He wanted to be seen as a businessman with cultural influence. At the same time, the Supreme Team had a reputation for being ruthless. They demanded loyalty, and those who disobeyed faced harsh punishment. Their crew was structured like a corporation, with lieutenants, enforcers, and dealers working under a clear chain of command. Their system made sure profits were high and disorder was low. This gave them stability that other groups lacked. Yet it also made them feared. To live in their area meant living under their shadow, whether you agreed with them or not. Their dominance in Queens seemed impossible to challenge. For many years, they were the most powerful group in the borough. They enforced rules with both rewards and threats, ensuring that everyone in the drug trade respected or feared Supreme's leadership. Eventually, the law caught up with them. Federal indictments, constant police attention, and long prison sentences broke down their empire. What once looked unstoppable began to crumble piece by piece as law enforcement put pressure on every part of the organization. Still, the legend of the Supreme Team did not disappear. In the streets of Queens, their name remained. They were remembered as the crew that ruled an era, a symbol of how a street family could rise to great power and wealth. The Supreme Team showed how discipline, strategy, and organization could make a criminal group last longer than most. Their story was not just about drugs, but about building an empire that reached from the corners of Queens to the worlds of music and film. Even today, their name is spoken with a mix of fear, respect, and fascination. They are remembered as one of the most influential crime families in New York, leaving behind a legacy that shows both the power and the destruction of the crack era.
The wealth that the Supreme Team collected was almost unbelievable. Reports said their crack and cocaine business made hundreds of thousands of dollars every single day. Over years, this turned into hundreds of millions, making them one of the richest street organizations in New York. But what made Supreme different from many others was his style. While other leaders showed off their money carelessly with gold, cars, and parties, Supreme chose a different image. He worked carefully to appear calm, sharp, and professional at all times. He was often seen stepping out of limousines, not cheap cars. He wore fine, custom-made suits that made him look like a businessman instead of a gangster. He wanted people to respect him, not just fear his power on the streets. This image helped him build influence that stretched far beyond South Jamaica, Queens. He wasn't only known by street dealers or local people. His name reached into music studios, record labels, and even Hollywood, giving him a wider reach than most street bosses. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, long after his strongest years in Queens, Supreme was still connected to powerful people in the music industry. His ties included links with record labels and rap stars who were shaping American hip-hop culture. One of his most famous connections was with Murder, Inc. Records. Through this relationship, Supreme met important music producers, rappers, and business people. These friendships blurred the line between crime and entertainment, making it harder to see where one world ended. For many rappers, Supreme represented the real-life version of the gangster stories they told in songs. Being close to him added credibility and toughness to their image. For Supreme, being close to rappers gave him legitimacy and respect in mainstream culture. This relationship between the streets and entertainment created a powerful mix. It showed how crime could influence not only local neighborhoods, but also national music and movies. Supreme had built a name that existed in two worlds at the same time. Unlike other leaders who were satisfied with fast money, Supreme wanted more. He wanted to be remembered as a businessman, someone who could sit at the same table as producers, directors, and stars. His image of sophistication opened doors that money alone could not. His influence grew so much that even after his drug empire started to weaken, his presence in the music world kept him relevant. He became a bridge between two cultures, representing both the streets of Queens and the lights of entertainment. The carefully built image of Supreme was one of his greatest weapons. Where others used violence and fear, he used presentation, suits, cars, and words. He convinced people that he was more than just another street boss. This ability made him different from many of his peers. He was disciplined in how he carried himself and focused on appearing strong but controlled. For this reason, his story stands out among the many crime families of the crack era. Supreme showed that crime was not always about chaos and flashy lifestyles. It could also be about strategy, appearance, and influence. His empire may have been built on drugs, but his public face was built on the image of power and professionalism. Even today, people remember him not only for his role in the drug world, but also for how he entered music and entertainment. His name remains linked to both destruction and culture, a reminder of how crime touched many sides of American life. The story of Supreme is one of ambition as well as crime. He wanted more than money. He wanted a lasting legacy. Whether on the streets of Queens or in Hollywood meetings, he carried himself as a man who demanded respect. His rise also shows how image can change power. By dressing well, choosing his words carefully, and building connections, Supreme created doors that others could not open. His story teaches how appearance can be as strong a tool as money or violence. At the same time, his choices brought risk. The more Supreme mixed with celebrities and entertainment, the more attention he received. Police, journalists, and rivals began to watch him more closely. The image that gave him power also drew dangerous eyes. Still, his name lives on in both street history and music culture. Many rappers still mention him, and his story is studied by those who want to understand how crime, culture, and business became linked in modern America during the crack era.
Supreme wanted his influence to last longer than the streets. He even tried to finance a film project, hoping that movies would make his name permanent. He wanted to move away from drug corners and into a world of culture. This move showed how deeply he wanted to cross from crime into mainstream society. For him, a film was more than entertainment. It was a way to show power in a new form and to leave behind a legacy. The connection between crime and culture became very clear through the Supreme Team. Their story showed how street power could affect not only one neighborhood, but also larger national trends. Music, movies, and fashion all felt their presence at some point. But while Supreme built ties in entertainment, on the streets, his team was feared for their ruthlessness. They enforced discipline with very strict methods. Loyalty was not a choice, but a requirement, controlled through both fear and rewards. The structure of the Supreme Team looked almost like a business corporation. They had lieutenants who acted like managers, enforcers who handled discipline, and dealers who moved the product. Each part of the system worked together to keep money flowing smoothly. This business-like setup allowed them to maximize profit while reducing disorder. They knew that chaos could bring police attention, so they tried to operate with discipline. Still, their methods of control were often violent, reminding everyone who truly held the power. Living in South Jamaica during this time meant living under the shadow of the Supreme Team. They weren't just a gang that people could avoid. They were the environment itself, shaping daily life in every block and corner. Their presence created a sense of inevitability. People felt as if the Supreme Team was always there and would always be there. Young people grew up hearing their names, and many could not imagine Queens without their power. The combination of wealth, structure, and fear made them one of the strongest groups of their time. They built a system that worked for years, showing how organized crime could control communities with both opportunity and intimidation. Yet, no empire lasts forever. The same strength that gave them control also made them a bigger target. Law enforcement could no longer ignore their reach. Federal agents and police worked together to find ways to bring them down. Eventually, the law caught up with the Supreme Team. Federal indictments were filed, naming many leaders and members. Long prison sentences followed, breaking apart the structure that had once seemed impossible to challenge. Piece by piece, their empire began to crumble. Unrelenting pressure from law enforcement made it harder for the team to survive. Raids, investigations, and trials removed key figures. Without its leaders, the organization weakened. The streets that once echoed with their name began to change slowly under police control. Still, their story did not simply vanish. Even after arrests and sentences, people continued to talk about them. Their name lived on in music, in movies, and in memories of Queens, showing how strong their influence had been during their reign. The fall of the Supreme Team showed a truth about crime empires. No matter how much money they made or how much fear they spread, the law always found a way to catch them. Their control could not last forever. For those who lived through their rule, memories remained sharp. Some recall fear and danger, while others remember opportunity and power. Either way, the Supreme Team left behind an image of how crime can shape communities deeply for many years. Their story became a lesson in power, culture, and ambition. They showed how crime could move beyond corners into national culture, but they also showed that the consequences of such power always arrived. Their empire ended, but their legacy still survives today.
The Supreme Team stands as both a warning and a symbol. They remind us of the destruction drugs brought into communities, but they also show how leadership, discipline, and image could lift a group far above the ordinary level of street crime. Even now, decades later, people in Queens talk about that time as if it were yesterday. The memory of the Supreme Team is like a shadow over the past, one that shaped the identity of an entire generation in South Jamaica. Their story remains one of the clearest examples of how crime and culture crossed paths. Supreme wanted to be more than a street king. For a while, he achieved that dream. But in the end, the law closed in.
The legend of the Supreme Team never fully disappeared. Even after arrests and prison sentences, their name lived on in Queens. People still remembered them as the crew that shaped an entire era, linked forever to the rise of crack cocaine. Their name carried both destruction and power. On one side, they brought pain, fear, and broken lives. On the other side, they showed how money and influence could grow in poor neighborhoods. They became symbols of both ruin and success. For many people, they were the perfect example of how a black family-run syndicate could rise to incredible wealth and influence right in the heart of New York City. Their empire became part of street history, whispered about for decades. After their fall, attention turned to another powerful family. This was the Jones family of Philadelphia, with a fortune estimated at $200 million. Unlike quick burning crews, the Jones family played a much longer and more patient game. They were led by the legendary Little Melvin Williams, a man whose life partly inspired the famous TV series The Wire. Under his leadership, the Jones family and their allies avoided reckless actions and instead built something strong and lasting. While many groups rushed to make fast money and show off their wealth, the Jones family quietly worked behind the scenes. In the 1970s and 1980s, their heroin distribution networks reached across the East Coast, quietly flooding cities with their product. Their empire stood out not only because of the scale of their operations, but also because of how smartly they handled their money. They did not just sell drugs, they carefully managed and grew their wealth like experienced businessmen. What separated them from countless other groups was foresight. Many crews wasted fortunes on gold chains, sports cars, and wild lifestyles. The Jones family, however, believed real power came from turning illegal money into clean assets that could last for generations. They invested in businesses that looked legitimate from the outside. They bought nightclubs that became social hotspots. They owned car dealerships that gave them cover for money flow. They even invested in real estate, buying properties that rose in value over time. This strategy made them harder for police to catch. While other groups drew headlines for violence and flashy spending, the Jones family blended into society. Their money trail was hidden under layers of businesses, straw owners, and cash-heavy operations. By the time law enforcement realized their strength, the Jones family already controlled a wide empire. They had clean businesses producing income, alongside illegal networks that kept their fortune growing. Their strategy made them one of the smartest groups of their time. They became symbols of quiet power. Unlike gangs that shouted their names, the Jones family let their influence speak through wealth and control. To outsiders, they looked like successful businessmen. To insiders, they were masterminds of one of the largest drug networks. This careful balance between appearance and reality gave them lasting strength. While others were arrested quickly, they survived for decades. Their model showed how patience, planning, and discipline could build a dynasty, even in the dangerous and unpredictable world of crime. The Jones family lived in luxury, but kept it away from the spotlight. They had big houses in the suburbs, filled with fine furniture, chandeliers, and expensive art.
Their driveways displayed Cadillacs and Mercedes, but their public lives seemed respectable. Their ability to live like kings while avoiding constant headlines made them unique. They were feared in the underground world, but respected in business circles. This dual identity made them one of the most remarkable families in the history of organized crime. By focusing on building a system that could last, they created something different from the short-lived empires around them. Their fortune was not just fast money, but long-term wealth. In this way, they were far ahead of their time. Their story showed that crime could be more than quick cash and chaos. It could evolve into something that looked almost like a dynasty, with wealth, businesses, and influence passed down to the next generation. They built power that outlasted many rivals. The Jones family stands as an example of strategy over speed. Their empire proved that thinking long-term could bring greater rewards than flashy spending. They blended into society while controlling the shadows, leaving behind one of the richest and most lasting legacies.
The Jones family found clever ways to hide their money. They laundered millions through nightclubs that also worked as community gathering spots, car dealerships that seemed legitimate, and real estate investments that grew in value every year. Their wealth became stronger with time. Every dollar that passed through their hands was carefully turned into something safe. Unlike stash houses or street corners that police could seize in one night, their investments were permanent. Their money was locked inside assets that could not be taken easily. Law enforcement suspected their power, but struggled to find evidence. The money trail was hidden beneath layers of businesses, straw owners, and heavy cash operations. Each move was designed to confuse investigators, making it nearly impossible to connect the money to drugs. The Jones family became icons of a new type of wealth in America's underworld. They did not want to be remembered as reckless dealers. They wanted their fortune to appear professional, to look permanent, and to survive far longer than street gangs. They wore custom suits, not flashy outfits. They wanted people to believe they were executives, not criminals. They understood that power did not just come from money, but also from respect, reputation, and how people saw them in everyday life. Their homes were not simple apartments in the city. They lived in huge suburban mansions far from the neighborhoods where heroin was sold. Their driveways showed off Cadillacs, Lincolns, and Mercedes. The separation between their lives and the streets was striking. Inside their houses, luxury was everywhere. Imported furniture decorated the rooms, crystal chandeliers shined above, and expensive art filled the walls. Their interiors showed they had a taste for fine living, similar to wealthy business leaders instead of street bosses. To outsiders, they seemed like successful men with strong businesses. They carried themselves with dignity, dressed in expensive suits, and moved confidently through society. Few would guess that their wealth came from the heroin trade, destroying communities across the East Coast. But beneath the polished image, their power still rested on crime. The drugs they distributed brought pain, violence, and addiction. Families broke apart, young people's lives were ruined, and whole neighborhoods suffered, while the Jones family enjoyed wealth and comfort. They understood, however, that survival meant discipline. Unlike other gangs that bragged about violence, they tried to remain quiet and smart. Their operations were structured carefully, and their decisions showed patience. This calm approach helped them avoid attention and arrests for many years. Every piece of their empire served a purpose. The nightclubs gave them a cover for cash, the car dealerships allowed them to appear respectable, and real estate gave them permanent value. Together, these pieces formed a shield around their criminal fortune. This management of wealth made them stand apart. Where other groups wasted fortunes on fast cars and jewelry, the Jones family thought about tomorrow. They wanted their empire to survive longer than themselves, to stand strong for the next generation. Because of these choices, they earned a reputation for sophistication. They were feared on the streets, but respected in high society. They blurred the line between crime and business, becoming a dynasty that lasted much longer than many of their rivals. They showed that crime could be run like a business, not just street chaos. Their focus was on order, planning, and strategy. They avoided mistakes that brought down other gangs, proving that patience often wins where recklessness fails. This made them unique in America's criminal history. Few groups were able to combine street dominance with business success so smoothly. They controlled the heroin trade while hiding behind the face of legitimate businesses, which made them much harder to challenge. Their double life was striking. In the suburbs, they were polite neighbors, dressed well, and seemed like successful businessmen. In the city, they were feared for their control over heroin. Two different worlds were tied together by the same family. What truly made the Jones family different was their vision. They did not only think of fast cash, they thought about building wealth that could survive for years, maybe even pass down to children and grandchildren. This made them more dangerous and enduring. Their empire was both admired and hated. Some saw them as clever leaders who turned nothing into something. Others saw them as the cause of misery in poor neighborhoods. Either way, their story remains one of the strongest in American crime history.
The Jones family left behind a model that few others of their time could copy. They were not only thinking about today's profits, they were thinking about tomorrow, and even about future generations who could inherit the empire they built. Their wealth was not about fast cars, short parties, or quick pleasures. It was about creating something strong that could last. They invested in businesses, properties, and safe assets so that their fortune would survive even after they were gone. In this way, they blurred the line between the underworld and regular society. They showed that organized black families in America could build not only fast street money, but also long-term, transferable assets that looked like normal business wealth. By the height of their power, the Jones family was whispered about as one of the richest black crime dynasties of their era. Their fortune was not only large, it was stable, and it inspired both fear and admiration. Their empire stood as proof that strategy could be just as powerful as violence, and that patience could outlast chaos. While other groups collapsed quickly under pressure, the Jones family's careful planning allowed them to last much longer. They were feared on the streets, respected in business circles, and remembered as pioneers of a new way of running crime. They showed how discipline and control could make illegal money look permanent, almost like wealth from legitimate businesses. The Jones family also showed that crime could act like a dynasty. This meant their power was not only about one leader or one generation, but about building something that could be passed down, like family companies or wealthy traditional families. This vision separated them from many of their rivals. Others focused only on today, but the Jones family built for the future. They believed power was not in showing off, but in creating wealth that would continue to grow. Their model made them difficult to stop. Even when law enforcement tried, their wealth was hidden inside businesses and properties. Arresting one person did not end the empire. The structure was built to survive pressure, making them almost untouchable for years.
This careful design gave them influence both inside and outside the underworld. To criminals, they were masters of the heroin trade. To businessmen, they looked like executives. To society, they were a strange mix of respectability and fear. Their story showed that crime was changing. It was no longer only about quick money and flashy shows of power. It was about control, investment, and building something bigger than just a single crew or a temporary street empire. Even today, their legacy is remembered as an example of how far planning could take a family. They lived in mansions, wore suits, and ran businesses while still controlling the flow of heroin on the East Coast. Their influence was undeniable. They proved that crime, when carefully calculated and tightly controlled, could evolve into something resembling a dynasty. Their wealth lasted longer than most, their influence reached further, and their name became part of the story of America's criminal underworld. The Jones family represented both destruction and ambition. They brought drugs that harmed thousands, but they also built wealth in ways that looked permanent. This contradiction made them both feared and respected, a symbol of power that seemed unshakable. At their peak, they stood alongside the greatest crime dynasties in America. Few could rival their wealth, their patience, or their vision. They had shown that with planning and discipline, an underground empire could look almost legitimate. Their chapter closed slowly, but their lessons remained. Strategy can rival violence. Patience can outlast chaos. And crime, when shaped into an empire, can leave a legacy that continues long after the streets themselves have changed. The Jones family also proved that organized black families could challenge stereotypes. They were not only feared criminals, but also smart investors. Their ability to navigate both the underworld and society made them unique, leaving a lasting impression on history. Their empire became a warning and an inspiration at the same time. To some, they were dangerous figures who fueled addiction. To others, they were visionaries who proved that long-term thinking could build a fortune even from the shadows. As their era ended, attention turned to another family who would rise even higher. This was the Barksdale organization of Baltimore, whose empire grew even larger, with a net worth estimated at $250 million at its height.
At number 1, the story returns to Baltimore. The Barksdale organization, led by Nathan Bodie Barksdale, became one of the most notorious and powerful drug trafficking rings in American history. Their empire reshaped West Baltimore throughout the 1980s and 1990s. They controlled entire neighborhoods, block by block. Their work was not just about selling drugs, but about total dominance. The Barksdales built a system so organized that it looked almost like a corporation, with bosses, managers, and workers all following clear orders. Heroin and cocaine poured through their network in massive amounts. Millions of dollars were earned every single month, and the money seemed endless. Their grip on the city was strong, and both fear and respect surrounded their name wherever it was spoken. Their story became so well known that it inspired the famous HBO television series The Wire. This show carried their legacy into American culture forever, making the Barksdale organization a symbol of both power and destruction in the world of drugs. The Barksdale story was more than a tale of crime. It was full of contradictions. On one side, they lived like kings. They enjoyed riches, cars, jewelry, and fame. On the other side, they brought harm and despair to their communities. Witnesses and investigators described fleets of luxury cars cruising Baltimore's streets. Cadillacs, Mercedes-Benz, and other expensive vehicles became common sights.
The Barksdales threw lavish parties where jewelry worth millions sparkled under bright lights, showing off their immense wealth and fearless ambition. Their homes in the suburbs stood like palaces built on drug profits. Expensive suits filled their wardrobes. Their lives included vacations to faraway places and access to exclusive clubs. They styled themselves as urban royalty, projecting authority to anyone who crossed them. But they were not just wealthy rulers. The contradiction came from their ties to the community. The drug trade brought violence and addiction, yet the Barksdale family was also known for giving back, supporting events, and helping families who were struggling. They sponsored local basketball tournaments that gave young people something positive to do. They hosted cookouts where neighbors could share meals. They sometimes paid bills for families in need. For some, these actions made them look like protectors of the community. This dual identity made the Barksdales both feared and respected. To the police, they were ruthless crime bosses who ordered hits and ruled with violence. To many residents, they represented ambition and success in a world with very few opportunities. Their operation was carefully structured. Lieutenants gave orders, enforcers maintained discipline, and street-level dealers kept the flow of money steady. Each part of the network answered directly to the top, creating a strong system that was difficult for law enforcement to break. At their peak, the Barksdale Empire was worth more than $250 million. But this number tells only part of the story. Their cultural impact through The Wire and countless stories turned them into legends remembered across America. The Barksdales lived in style. Their parties became famous in Baltimore, full of music, food, and glittering wealth. They wore expensive suits, diamond jewelry, and designer shoes. They looked like businessmen, but their fortune came from drugs that hurt thousands. They represented both crime and culture. They were feared drug lords and admired symbols of ambition. Their empire showed how a family could rise from poverty to control entire neighborhoods, leaving behind a legacy that blurred the line between criminals and kings. Yet their story was also one of tragedy. Their success destroyed families and fueled addiction. Violence followed their business wherever it spread. The same organization that gave them power also left their communities scarred, broken, and deeply damaged for generations. Law enforcement eventually tightened its grip. Investigations, indictments, and arrests followed. Members of the Barksdale network faced long sentences, and their once powerful empire slowly collapsed. The money and influence faded, but the story of their rule lived on. For Baltimore, the Barksdale era is unforgettable. It was a time of power, destruction, and contradiction. They lived like kings, but stood on foundations of pain. They were protectors to some, predators to others, and legends to the rest of America. At their height, the Barksdale organization proved that crime could reach levels of power similar to real businesses. But their fall proved another truth. No empire built on drugs, violence, and fear can last forever. Their legacy remains, both dark and unforgettable.
The Barksdale family did more than just sell drugs. These sponsored basketball tournaments, hosted cookouts, and sometimes gave money to struggling families in West Baltimore. For many people who had very little, this support made them seem like protectors and leaders. For their neighborhoods, the Barksdales were a paradox. They were feared and respected at the same time. They were predators spreading addiction, yet protectors offering food, money, and chances. They brought wealth and destruction into places that had suffered for generations. This dual identity cemented their legend. To law enforcement, they were ruthless bosses. They ordered killings, demanded loyalty through fear, and expanded their empire without mercy. To people on the streets, they were proof that success was possible against heavy odds. They represented ambition in its rawest form. In a city filled with poverty and systemic racism, they showed that power and wealth could be taken, even if it was illegal. But their power also proved how costly ambition could be for communities. It was this strange mix of brutality and generosity, crime and charisma, that made their story resonate beyond Baltimore. They were not simply gangsters. They became figures that represented urban power, shaping both local memory and national conversations about crime. At their peak, the Barksdale organization controlled millions. Their empire was worth more than $250 million. But the money is only one part of their story. Their influence on culture and society made them unforgettable in American history. They inspired the HBO series The Wire, which turned their lives into a national story. Through this show, their world was introduced to millions, ensuring their legend would last long after their empire collapsed in the streets of Baltimore. They became household names. To some, they symbolized destruction. To others, they symbolized possibility. They represented the story of America's urban underworld, where crime, survival, and ambition came together to create dynasties that rivaled real billionaires, even if only for a moment. Their story was never just about money. It was about legacy. They left behind a name that blurred the line between myth and reality. They were remembered as both villains and kings, feared predators and admired leaders, depending on who told the story. For these families, crime was never only about survival. It was about empire building. They rose from nothing, often from the shadows of poverty and racism, and created dynasties powerful enough to shape entire communities and even influence music and culture. Some of these dynasties burned out quickly, destroyed by greed or violence. Others managed to transition into entertainment and culture, living on through music, film, and art. Some still exist quietly, whispered about in neighborhoods where their stories began. But all of them remind us of one truth. In America, even crime can build a dynasty. These empires began on broken streets, but grew into names recognized across the country, showing the strange ways ambition and desperation can shape history. The Barksdales, like others, built wealth from almost nothing. They also showed that with power comes risk. No criminal empire can last forever. Their rise was fast, their reign was powerful, and their fall was inevitable, but their story never disappeared. Communities still speak about them with both fear and fascination. For some, they were symbols of pain. For others, they were symbols of power. Either way, their names remain etched into the memory of Baltimore and into America's wider story. Their empire proved that crime could rival legitimate business empires. Their downfall proved that such power was fragile and could not escape the law forever. Yet their cultural influence, through stories and legends, ensures their memory lives on beyond prison walls. In the end, their legacy was about more than drugs. It was about how survival, ambition, and leadership shaped entire generations. They rose from poverty to kingship, only to fall under the weight of their own empire. But their legend endures. The Barksdale family, along with the other families in this story, created dynasties that stood between myth and reality. They blurred the lines between criminals and kings, predators and protectors, leaving behind legacies too powerful to ever fully disappear. Their stories reveal the complicated truth of America's urban history. They show how poverty and racism created conditions where crime became a path to power. They also show how ambition, even when destructive, can leave behind a legacy that outlasts lifetimes. The Barksdale's name continues to echo in Baltimore and beyond. They represent a time when crime shaped communities as deeply as business or politics. To some, they are symbols of caution. To others, they are legends of possibility and survival. Their empire ended, but their story became part of America's cultural fabric. They remind us that power can come from unexpected places, and that even in crime, people seek legacy. Theirs was a legacy of money, myth, and unforgettable influence.